Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd. I'm Cris Alvarez and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Jonathon Lethem, author of The Arrest, published by Ecco, today, November 10th, 2020. Thank you for speaking with me.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on the show.
Sure. So first, obviously you have a lot of ideas rolling around in your head as a writer. How did this particular idea rise above the rest and get written?
That's a great way to describe it. Well, usually I have been kind of sitting with an idea, or sometimes it's not an idea, but like an image for a book for a long time before I can even consider starting it. This is never a sudden procedure. It's usually been a couple of years of kind of ruminating over something and letting other ideas attach to it like flypaper. And this was one of those. There are aspects of it that I think harken back to stories or ideas I've had in my head for decades, really. The supercar, the cross-country, post-apocalyptic country adventure is hardly my own invention. In a way, it's a response to an archetypal idea, one that you meet in something like Cormac McCarthy's The Road or Damnation Alley, which was, I think, a Roger Zelazny story before it was turned into a George Papard movie in the 70s. And even the Blue Streak, which is what I call the supercar in my story, was the name of a unique race car that was driven in a Shaggy Dog story that my father used to tell me and my brother at bedtimes serially. He would tell us about the continuing adventures of the Blue Streak. So there are all kinds of things in this that are, not even really my own. They're more like archetypal images that I'm kind of making my own, turning into something more personal. And then, of course, the setting in Maine, it's a place that's meant a lot to me, and small towns in coastal Maine. I've been spending time there for decades, but it's not ordinarily something I write about. I'm known for writing about California and New York City, and so somehow making my imprint on this space that means a lot to me by turning it into the scene of one of my ridiculous comic dystopias was really exciting for me. So there's something about the collision of this idea of a kind of widescreen, spectacular post-apocalyptic story with the very intimate pastoral image of the small town in Maine that's mainly characterized by the locavore culture and pretty little islands off the coast. Something about the collision of scales, I think, for me, was the real source of interest in this story.
So tell me a bit about the protagonist, the setting, and the conflict that we have.
Yeah, well, so I live now on the edge of Los Angeles, and I've never really been a citizen of LA as one envisions it from an East Coast life. The Hollywood sign, the beach cities, and the film industry. But like almost anyone who grew up in 20th century culture, I'm also a product of that place. Absorbing the culture of the film industry, loving and hating it all at once, has been a life pursuit for me, and I've written about it in lots of different ways. I've translated my excitement for and revulsion of Hollywood product into my fiction over and over again, and I've also had now, 3 decades into writing novels, I've had my share of kind of weird glancing encounters, some of them very stimulating and some of them flattering and some of them very humiliating, where people wanted to work with me or wanted to adapt one of my stories or novels into something. And so I have a kind of a long-standing tourist's curiosity for the means of production, the world of film pitching and producers and all that glorious claptrap that goes on. And so the two in a way, the two main characters of this story, the point of view character, Journeyman, and his abhorrent, charismatic, disastrous friend, Todd Baum, are really archetypal figures from Hollywood. They're the power producer, the mogul type who makes stuff happen and therefore is a bully and a vampire and a salesman and tends to step all over people. And there's the enabler. There's the guy who fixes scripts and tinkers with them, and he's a yes man, and he's a development guy who kind of, he's like the glue that makes things stick together there. And that's Journeyman. That's the main character. And the two of them have been thrown, both in their different ways, completely out of any meaningful context by the collapse of everything that gave them a reason for being. There is no Hollywood. There's no multiplex. There's no film industry. There isn't even really money anymore. What do you do without money if you're in the film industry? So they both are kind of stuck in this residual space where it's very unclear what kind of life is available to people from the culture industry after this particular kind of catastrophe that I invented. Journeyman, who's a very mild and kind of accommodating type of person, his response is to kind of melt into the background. And Todd Baum, the producer, has the opposite. The opposite instinct. He wants to find a way to still, produce a spectacular, even if there's no multiplex for it to play in. He wants there to be a world where his tyrannical imagination can still loom large.
So, you said you put it in Maine. So, did you do that out of familiarity, or did you want to put these characters into a sort of more pristine, real kind of culture, where people are more honest about stuff?
That's a great description, and I would definitely endorse it. There's something about the groundedness of that environment. Even now when you can get on the internet and there is all sorts of distracting stuff that goes on because it's part of America, part of the United States. But I feel in a way reduced and restored in a very attractive way to like the life of the senses and of my body when I'm hanging out in coastal Maine. There's something also that's, it's a cliche, but there's something kind of timeless about remote parts of rural New England where there's still tumbled down stone walls that farmers built, and the people who live in the house, the stone wall separates their field from yours, turn out to be the great-grandchildren of the farmer who pulled those field stones out and built that wall. There's a continuity that's very, it's kind of cuts against the grain of American velocity where everything is always changing and being slicked up and transformed and made new. So yeah, it was a kind of super contrast to other ingredients in my story.
So I guess I'm trying to get a feel for more of this changed world, because the book blurb says it's not post-apocalypse, not dystopia, not utopia. It's just everything stops working. So I'm just trying to explore that. Has everything quieted down? Has everything fallen apart?
Right. That's the catch, isn't it? Is that it's so localized. The book and the experience of the characters is so completely reduced to their immediate orbit that one is left to guess, the reader with the characters, left to guess about what's happening in the wider sphere. And this is something that really interests me. I've been curious about this ever since I was a kid. I remember I was listening to the radio in New York City at the what's now the Pacifica station. Used to play all these Alan Watts lectures, and I would listen to Alan Watts talk, and he seemed very wise and persuasive and funny to me. And there was one where he said, "What's the use of learning about distant disasters? Stop putting the news on, because it has nothing to do with you. You can't change it. You can only absorb this anxiety. Now, this is a really weird thought because we're accustomed increasingly to the sense of global connectedness, which seems in some sense very admirable, that we should feel that we're not okay. It's not all right to be, let's say, well-fed where we live if there are other people elsewhere starving. Mm-hmm. This seems like a kind of global conscience that could drive a transformation, a revolution in global consciousness, right? But on the other hand, what do we actually experience of this? We mostly just kind of wring our hands at the reports coming in from afar. And that tension is really uncomfortable. So I wanted to flip that discomfort around and look at it from another angle in the book, where the characters, they can't even find out whether their own aging parents are still alive anymore. I mean, they've really lost any ability, and it's heightened most particularly for the characters in my book because they're on a peninsula that is itself sort of encircled by this, taciturn, kind of vaguely hostile local power that they call the cordon.
Okay.
And so they can't even cross out of their own territory voluntarily very easily, let alone get, email or phone calls or newspapers from afar. There is no such thing anymore. So what does that do to your sense of complicity, involvement, responsibility to others? It's just really a puzzle. And the characters are, they're at some level, they're sort of morally paralyzed by these concerns. It gives them an appetite and an apprehension to know stuff from afar. And that in turn puts them at the mercy of a liar like Todd Baum, who comes barreling in and says, well, I can tell you what's going on elsewhere. The problem is, of course, he's unwilling to be even halfway truthful about it. He may be incapable of being truthful about it.
I'm speaking with Jonathon Lethem, author of The Arrest. You can find more information about his work at jonathonlethem.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. Now back to the podcast. How do people communicate then in this setting of yours? Is it just by mouth, by some writing?
Yeah, there isn't even a whole lot of writing because the town is small enough that, gossip and conversation, fireside conversation gets most everything told, so no one is even putting a lot of effort into what you might sentimentalize as like a small town newspaper, but it would seem maybe almost like a waste of resources to the folks in the book.
I see.
Which, for people of people of the media like myself, and I'm guessing you, is kind of uncomfortable. I think the people who are running these towns, the organic farmers and the very rooted local culture, one of the things that's disconcerting is how admirable but also maybe what ciphers they can seem. One of the origins for this book, in a way, Cris, is that I used to, it's a default joke when you're someone like me who grew up, my father was a painter. I grew up wanting to make art. And you kind of, if you grow up in an apocalyptic worldview, as I did growing up, in the 60s and 70s, we still did bomb shelter drills at school. And I, watched The Twilight Zone and read Philip K. Dick novels. So I was sort of pretty sure that someday civilization would be reduced to rubble. Well, so one of the first things you think is, well, I guess I would be the storyteller. They'll still need people like me, right? I mean, I'll be the one who carries forward the art forms and the legends and the myths. And one of the jokes that this book kind of is pegged on is actually, after everything collapses, nobody really needs the storyteller. He's kind of a spare part. And that's Journeyman, right? He's just, they're just puzzled by what he used to do and whether it has any future. And in fact, they just convert him into the delivery guy and the one who cleans up after the butcher. And, it might be even worse than that. It might be that it's not just neutral and useless to be a storyteller, but people in this future might look at myth making and legend and storytelling as like part of the sickness that they got over. Might be part of the problem.
Yeah. So it sounds as though without other forms of communication that the society you describe has devolved into sort of a sort of tyranny in a sort, that it almost argues, at least from what I'm hearing, is that globalization helps people maybe free themselves from situations, whereas here, without the communication, you're kind of stuck with whatever is around you.
I think that's right. It's a exercise in deep locality, the immediacy of where your body happens to be stuck at. Journeyman was only vacationing in Maine when this thing hit. He could have been anywhere, but everything about his present life is determined by the fact it's like musical chairs, right? It's where he was the day it happened. And yeah, you lose the points of comparison. So the way society sets up shop right around you is all you're going to know and all you're going to be able to concern yourself with. You can't really do the propositional work of saying, hey, look, maybe we can model ourselves on this other thing. There isn't really mirroring.
So even though this is sort of it's a work of fiction and it's kind of a fantastic setting in a sense, did you do any research of any sort?
Well, all of the books involve some kind of research. In many cases, it's a fairly oblique sort of, checking in with other fictions that I'm aware of that maybe were influential on my deep thinking about this kind of story, and that then I need to kind of recontact them, or others that I've always just wondered what they were about. I grew up loving a book called Earth Abides and another book called Dr. Blood Money. The first one by George R. Stewart, the second one by Philip K. Dick. And these are archetypal stories, for me anyway, from my imagination, about collapsed U.S. civilization. And then again, there were others that I just knew existed, and I had to kind of seek them out and figure out what they were doing, and even others that appeared, like Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel was published while I was beginning to write this book and think about what I was doing. And so that's a kind of research. In some very small and sporadic ways, there were things about the farming traditions, the actual physical necessities for farming in that part of Maine that, even though they were right in front of my face, I'd never learned anything about, which now I had to at least become minimally able to describe. And but this was not one of my research intensive books. I wouldn't say that.
Do you feel like in the course of writing it, maybe not the research, did you discover something about Maine that you didn't realize before?
Well, sure. Or I articulated to myself things that I was feeling about Maine and found ways to kind of name them. But even deeply specific stuff about the soil, the fact that all the organic farms in that area array themselves along a specific axis, a road. It turns out it's really a difference, even on one part of the peninsula to the next, how fertile the soil is and why it's different. They're like geological things I learned about Maine. But I also, I'm not sure it's so much a matter of learning facts as it is just, realizing why my affinities or why my responses to the place are the way they are. One of the things that I grew up a city kid, and if you look at, the very personal books I've written about that locality, about Brooklyn, I'm obsessed with neighborhoods, right? Like the way you're on one block or in one neighborhood, and you cross some important boundary. It might be invisible to other people, but everything changes. A different ethnicity, a different gang rules this other zone, and you're going to feel different when you cross that street. Well, when I was halfway through this book, it may seem really obvious and like, how could I not have noticed this? But I realized I was experiencing the difference between these very tightly knit small town communities and the way they edge against each other and are, have micro differences, but they're overwhelmingly distinct to the people who live in them. Mm-hmm. That I was translating the same sense of Brooklyn neighborhood culture, the way you could go from Carroll Gardens to Cobble Hill and have everything change, was also how I was thinking about the mosaic of little towns on this peninsula.
Mm-hmm. If someone were not from an area and, did, tourist activities in an area, you might just look at the superficial and say, oh, this is all similar. This is what Maine is. But like you say, if you're from there, you delve deeper, you can start to see the little details that differentiate different regions. Important details that, and again, like you say, like mentioning Brooklyn, like gangs, it's more than just what you can enjoy or see. It's like, how safe is this area? Do I fit in?
Yeah. What are the chances that, physical violence is going to underlie someone's approach to difference or disagreement, and this constant having to measure that, that's where power hides, is actually in the ability to, oppress another body with violence. And I think in this book, it's a very quiet and, in some ways almost, the threats in the book are absurdly understated, but that they exist matters tremendously.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's a lot of, what's the sort of the feel of your book? Is it more lighthearted and maybe tends towards introspection, or is there more danger, or what's the feel of it?
Well, I think it's pretty much a kind of an autumnal, pastoral, atmosphere, and the tension that can lurk underneath something like that, the disquiet of the quiet pastoral, was something that I was interested in. And it doesn't exactly become violent, but there is a kind of convulsion towards the end of the book. And I was thinking about things like, a Hitchcock film like The Trouble with Harry or The Birds, where there's a prevailing calm and then menace that erupts. This is also, it's a very archetypal small town notion. You could also look to something like Straw Dogs, because one of the things that intrigues me is the argument that awaits anyone thinking about a kind of anarchist restructuring of society, is like, who's going to deal with the bad person? Who's going to deal with the sociopath? Right. Do you leave that for some other sociopath? Do you elect a sheriff? Do you have a posse? Do you draw straws? Like, what is actually done?
Yeah. And then you're delving into what sort of government do you want? How much ability to commit violence do you want the government, like you say, the sheriff, right, the person in charge? How far are they allowed to go?
Yeah, absolutely.
What would you say? So on this vein of the aesthetic and feel of the book, would you say it has any sort of soundtrack? Can you imagine like a musical feel to it in any way?
That's a great question. It's funny. I was asked that the other day by someone who knows that I actually do almost always make a really definite soundtrack, a Spotify playlist or a mixtape to go with each of my books. And someone says, "Where's the Arrests playlist?" And I realized it was really, for me, an uncharacteristically unmusical book. And I think some of that it's like an example of how different I am from Journeyman. They're superficial ways. Aging white man who makes his living in culture, where you could be like, oh, is Journeyman just a version of Lethem? But it's precisely in the instance of something like that he doesn't listen to music and doesn't have favorites, and that it's hard to imagine him being obsessed with a band or a singer, the way I am, pretty much always kind of obsessed with bands and singers, that captures his weird blankness. There's something kind of missing in him. And in this case, it happens to be I guess, allegorized this autism or blankness, the kind of way in which he's an unfinished, or in a way not even started, personality that goes together with there not being any soundtrack.
So maybe forgot what his original career had been, but it sounds like he's someone who disseminates culture, but he's a person without culture himself.
Yeah, his job specifically is he rewrites other people's movies. He's a script doctor. That's the colloquial term for it. And he's a really good one. He can really jump in at the spur of the moment and, kind of make a dumb, lazy Hollywood script, 15% more appealing, right? So it's not like he has no capacities, but they're not really for originating anything of his own. They're passive. They're kind of, he's like a rewrite man.
So you did mention some of the books, some of the things you enjoyed that sort of inspired this idea. Do you only sort of partake of that sort of media, or is there other stuff that inspires you?
Well, I have a lot of a really kind of crazy chaos of appetites for cultural things. I like, I like TV shows, and I like art house movies, and I listen to ridiculous variety of different kinds of music. I mean, I have favorites and things that I go back to again and again, but I am pretty restless, and I think that my, for better or worse, my restless appetite for novelty is reflected in the books. They're also different one from the next, and even within them, I think they can be seen as reflecting my unwillingness to choose between different modes or genres. I tend to pack different kinds of storytelling ideas and tones together into one space. Mm-hmm. I'm sure it may drive some readers crazy, but for better or worse, it's sort of my signature impulse.
So what do you think you consume the most, or what do you think you, what do you consume the most of? Are you more of a reader, TV, films?
The thing ultimately that I come back to, that I center in, is the reading of novels. And that's why I write them. Because it's, as much as I love all these other things, I play music constantly, but there's also, what am I capable of doing? I don't have the musical gift. So novels are my home base, and reading them is a constant companion.
Is there anything out of the ordinary that you do when you write to complete either drafts, interim drafts, or the final work?
Yeah. Well, I do have one. I was thinking about this recently, because this book is an extreme example. I do like, for the final revision, to make some radical change that necessitates reworking parts of the book. Sometimes it can almost be kind of arbitrary, but it drives me in the revision process to take a really hard look at every single thing in the book. So often there's some major piece that I'll add at the last minute, or some other piece that I'll take out at the last minute, or I'll reframe things in terms of, point of view. Or in this case, it was a book written in the first person, and I transformed it in the final draft into the third person.
So just to make sure I understand, you're saying you purposefully add sort of a change that doesn't go
I like
along.
there to be one new feature that comes in late, that helps me see the book in entirely new light.
That's interesting. So considering how much writing you've done, when did you start implementing that technique?
That's a good question. I'm not sure when that became a conscious strategy. It's been with me long enough now, but it probably wasn't right at the beginning. I mean, early on, every revision seems like a total adventure and a necessity. You're learning, you grow so much even between the different drafts of a given project. So every revision is a kind of mountain that you're climbing into the unknown. I think maybe at some point I arrived at this procedure that I've just described to you as a way to restore or reinscribe that kind of intensity, of discovery. You want always to feel like you're writing, things you've never thought of before. You've never been able to think before. And so it's a way of forcing myself into that space of not knowing.
Mm-hmm. So apart from this, are there things that have changed, say, from your first published work to this one, things that you've changed in your writing, your approach to writing?
Well, I've been at it long enough. I almost feel like I've changed and circled back both. You endlessly are discovering how much your early influences and your early inclinations are still with you and still shape what you're doing. I'm very conscious of it with this book, that this is the kind of book that I wanted to write, that I was trying to write when I was in my 20s. I wouldn't have come up with these exact elements, and I wouldn't have been capable of putting them together in the way that I have here. But I think that, one of the cool things about trying to do so many different things as a writer, which I've really tried to vary as much as possible, is that paradoxically it illuminates how deeply your work is your own and unified by your obsessions, your sensibilities, your strengths and weaknesses, your absolute limits. You can keep trying to be not yourself, and you always end up yourself.
Yeah. I'm speaking with Jonathon Lethem, author of The Arrest. You can find more information about his work at jonathonlethem.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. Now back to the podcast. So have you always been a writer, or did you do other work that's influenced how or what you write?
Well, I started out, it's really specific, and it's a lucky story. I started out thinking I would be a painter because my dad was one, and I grew up in this house where he was in the studio all the time, and I absorbed this practice, and I thought it was really cool, and I watched him do it, and I learned to paint and draw almost before I, knew how to read. So it seemed really native to me in a way, and I was, I kind of inherited his hand-eye coordination. I had a little bit of a gift for visual art, so it would impress grown-ups very easily, and so I got a lot of positive feedback for it. So it's like, of course I'm going to be one. I was just doing the following in his footsteps sort of thing. And what's interesting about it is how, I had to totally undo that thinking and change to become a writer. But in another sense, the training, the practice, the habit of going into the studio, all of that was very much nourishing to my writing capacity. It really was, training to be in the arts turns out to be not so different depending on which art it is. And I felt, compared to other writers who I would get to know, other aspiring writers I would get to know in my teens and 20s, who I realized just had no idea what it was to spend time making art. They wanted to do it, but they didn't have any example nearby. That my father's painting had taught me a lot of what I was going to need to know. So I was definitely a different thing before I was a writer, but it was a very relevant thing.
Interesting. So when you were writing this book, were there parts, did you sort of overwrite and have to take stuff out? Or are you more of an, underwriter? That's probably not the term, but,
This book shrank a little bit in the reworking. And some of that had to do with that change I talked about, where it went from being a first-person story told directly by Journeyman to being a third-person story where he was a character. And he was just kind of a talker. It was a little bit windy. And I realized that while some other books I'd written in the past, I think had thrived on having a chatty, garrulous narrator kind of talking to the reader and making friends with them and digressing a lot. But actually it was really aggravating in this version of the arrest to have him too much between you and the story. So I stripped it down a little bit. But that wasn't a matter of like losing whole scenes or anything. It was almost always more a question of just alterations in the language, the sentences, taking out digressions.
So what, apart from what you just described, taking him out from between the reader and the story, what other changes do you feel like what did it cause, or what else did it do when you did that?
Well, it was advantageous because we got to look at him and judge him a little more coolly. Instead of having to be inside his head and have him dominating your understanding of everything and then having to kind of overthrow him in order to make a critical thought about him, it became much, much easier to see his deficits.
Mm-hmm. Now, how about sympathy for the character? Do you lose some sympathy then, it seems like?
It's not built in the same way. But then again, you might actually make it more possible also to sympathize with them because they're not, in a way, they're not bullying you. You can look at them and say, well, okay, you've got some limits, but you're trying. Mm-hmm. Whereas if the character is narrating in the first person, it's sort of like they're dominating you and you're going to have to resist it. Unless they're so warm and winning that you don't want to. But that's a very rare first-person narrator that you don't resent sometimes, Did
you feel bullied by the character as you were writing the character in first person? Did you feel like the character was taking over in a sense?
I wouldn't put it that way, but I never feel that in exactly the way that you've just termed it, which is a kind of a common description that I find a little bit inexplicable. I'm exploring with the characters, but I don't ever really have that sensation of them taking over.
Okay. So a bit of a whimsical question here. When you were younger, was there any power technology or fictional setting that you yearned for?
Wow. Well, that's really interesting because, one of the things that this book is about in some ways is my realization that a lot of the so-called apocalyptic narratives that interested me were partly fantasies, I thought, on the part of the writer, and certainly indulged this feeling in me as a reader that it might be nicer to have some fewer technologies. I grew up with a lot of cautionary stories about the future, 1984, and watching Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. Mm-hmm. So I was, if anything, I tended to be a kind of a technophobe, but then again, I was a great one for vicarious fantasizing, and it's not an accident that I wrote an autobiographical novel about a kid who gets actual superpowers. I did plenty of vicarious flying dreams and wishes to have the ability to transcend or the combination of the power to fly away and to fly over, or to become, invisible and be able to spy on, not be seen. Mm-hmm. All of those things were parts of my coming of age.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you mentioned you read Philip K. Dick. Have you seen do you feel, I don't know how much into his work you were or are, do you feel like it's translated well, or other stuff that you've liked that you've seen turned into movies?
Well, I have a kind of a distaff view of adaptation. I don't think it's very interesting to try to make quote unquote faithful adaptations of things. Mm-hmm. Usually it just fizzles, first of all, mm-hmm. and disappoints. It never seems to make sense. And what it tends to do is expose how very different the forms are. If you make mm-hmm. A film that's as much like a beloved novel as you can, it usually just makes you feel like, oh, well, I guess it's just not filmable. Or novels aren't films. They don't translate into films well. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you take elements and you just throw them into a totally new paradigm, and you say, what cinematic thing could I make out of these scraps, these impulses, these, images or characters? Then sometimes you get something really wonderful, which is like another object, another narrative thing, which has a kind of a, DNA in common with the novel, but is just its own thing. And so I love adaptations that are really extremely different. I guess the hallmark example being Blade Runner from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. I mean, it's a novel I love and it's a film I love, but they're not really that. The tone, the emphasis, the atmosphere, even the ideas are not really the same.
Yeah,
it's really that they just sort of share some sort of like 15% DNA.
Yeah. So as a novelist living in LA, what's your opinion of, the films the stuff that comes out of Hollywood? Are you appreciative of the spectacle, or is it something that turns you off? And do you prefer the arts house?
If you're in the mood on the right night, getting into a darkened auditorium with a bunch of other hungry minds and gobbling up some spectacle, that's a great sport. Do I think that most of what comes out of Hollywood is worth even glancing at twice? No, it's, like almost every other kind of thing, it's like 90% shit. That was, I think, Sturgeon's law. But 90% of everything is shit. But that's okay. The 10% is where you want to live, whether it's books or music or movies or anything else. And the rest, time takes care of the rest. It weeds it out.
It makes me wonder sometimes, like, does it take the 90% to define what the good 10% is? I guess
I'm sure that there's some fundamental, it's like almost like a sea creature that lays, 1,000 eggs and only 100 of those are going to like reach an actual adulthood. The others are going to drift away or get gobbled up by other creatures.
Yeah.
So,
did you have any difficulties finishing this book?
This one was really a dream project. I had a lot of joy writing it. I felt really centered in it. I felt really like I knew what I wanted it to be, and I didn't get interrupted by any significant, life events or irresistible creative temptations. I never got derailed. It was really one that I stayed in all the way, and that felt good.
And you're an established writer, so any issues with getting published, or?
Well, this was a book that had been the back end of a 2-book deal, as they say in publishing. So it was always had an editor kind of waiting for it, which is a luxury. I enjoy. It frees me when I get in that situation, which I have a couple of times, because I tend to let myself write the most eccentric and willful kind of books when I think there's nothing they can do about it. They already agreed to publish it.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to have a similar theme or genre or anything to the first book.
Well, it couldn't. That wouldn't work for me because I always am so almost obsessively not repeating myself, one book to the next. Sometimes I circle back around to a mode 3 or 4 books later, but I usually make subsequent books as different from the ones before them as I can.
And what's your current writing project?
I am totally just staring at a lot of possibilities, and I've written a couple of short stories, but no next novel is yet on my table. So
short stories that are being published?
One was already published, and another one I think will be in a month or so. So they don't come that fast anymore. I used to write short stories at a faster clip. These each took a good long time. So
interesting. So where can people find you online?
Barely at all, just because I'm so obsessive that I don't let myself get drawn in because it would probably become all I did. So I have website that I use as a bulletin board, and right now it's basically a really simple bulletin board that just describes that the new book exists and that I'll be doing some Zoom events for it, and I guess that's a form of finding me online now that's possible. I'll be in 5 or 6 different Zoom book tour events in the next few weeks.
And what's that website name or the address?
Oh, just JonathonLethem.com. Yeah. Okay,
and I'll spell that for listeners. It's JONATHAN and then LETHEM.com. You said, right?
That's it.
All right. So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, that's wonderful, Cris. Thank you. It was a really good conversation.
Good, thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, please subscribe and rate it if you can. If you want more fiction and fiction studies ranging from ancient mythology to modern-day sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or crisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. On my webpage, you'll also find written interviews and links to my social media accounts on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I also discuss art, acting, comic books, gaming, and much more. Thanks again, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.